Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
This week on Heroic Media, a leading psychologist warns addictions to pornography and video games are creating a masculinity crisis.
A young Catholic woman responds to claims that the Catholic Church oppresses women.
Stylist Rachel Zoe opens a nursery in her office.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we deal with news headlines dealing with family, marriage, and life. And the reason that we focus on those issues is that they're fundamental to society. They're really foundational for all the other issues that you see.
That's right, and a lot of times the topics will be about abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So Patrick, what's our first story?
All right, in our first story, Philip Zimbardo, a leading psychologist and professor emeritus at Stanford University, says in his new book that pornography and video game addiction is leading to a masculinity crisis. So there's a lot I'm sure that we could talk about. It's certainly a conversation starter topic. I think just based on my experience that I could see how what he's saying is true. Some don't agree with his claims, but he had a study where I guess there was 20,000 young men, and they basically studied their relationships, particularly with video games and pornography, and they tried to focus on those that were kind of isolated too. It was just them in their room with video games and pornography, and kind of studied what was going on with these people and how that affected their lives, their relationships, their masculinity. And I thought there was a lot to uncover, I guess, about it.
It's very interesting, and we see there's obviously a difference between video games and pornography. Pornography is inherently wrong. It's inherently evil. There's something that is objectifying women.
Yes.
It's a perversion of sexuality. It's a misuse of our sexual nature. And then video games, which in and of themselves are not necessarily bad.
Right.
There can be ones that are sexual or violent, but video games themselves are not bad. But what he's finding is that there's this attitude, this addiction where it's taken to excess.
Yes.
And so somebody will go in their room and play video games for 15 hours straight.
And think that it's completely normal.
I think that it's totally normal.
Yeah.
And then you have the pornography in there. And one of the comments that I thought this was really interesting that he made was that when he's talking about excess in the use of porn and video games. And he said excess does not have to do with the number of hours.
Yes.
It's a psychological change in mindset. And that you'll actually hear people saying, when I'm in class, I wish I was playing World of Warcraft. That's a video game.
Yeah.
When I'm with a girl, I'll wish I was watching pornography because I'll never get rejected.
Yeah.
So you can see that mindset there, that excess mindset is what he calls it, where they prefer these visual stimulants to reality.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it is. And he also says it's kind of like this new form of addiction. And I'm glad that you made the distinction between video games and pornography and all that. But they're related because, well, first of all, that's all they're consuming their time with. But he says that both of those activities can basically, it's kind of forming a new type of addiction. And he said it begins to change brain function. It begins to change the reward center of the brain and produces a kind of excitement and addiction. And so he just is basically saying that boys' brains are being reprogrammed digitally, he says. And they're being digitally rewired, kind of. And so it's like drug addiction. The brain senses that, hey, this is where I get my pleasure from, and it can't be satisfied in other ways, so that's all they begin to think about. And it kind of rewires them to want to have those things and only those things, is what he found in his studies.
Exactly, and they actually have done studies where monitoring brain activity, and they found that the brain activity of a pornography addict is the same as a drug addict, that the same parts of the brain are lighting up.
Yeah.
It really is addictive, and recovery programs that try to help people who are struggling with pornography have also found that they treat it as an addiction because that's what you have to do to conquer it, because that's what it is. It really is shaping and changing the brain.
Yeah.
And he's talking about some of the other problems that many young men are having today as far as social development, academic achievement, ability to have a successful physical, intimate relationship with a real woman. They're
Yes.
struggling in all these areas. And he's saying this is partly due potentially to this crisis of this new type of addiction.
Yep, absolutely. And I know we mentioned like social isolation, and you just mentioned like interacting with relationships and those types of things. In my college experience, and this was ended like 10 years ago, so it's been a while. But I mean, pornography and video gaming at all hours was pretty rampant, and so this isn't anything new necessarily or shocking to me. But one of the things that I found interesting that because I've had some of these conversations with people before that suffered from these types of things. And, I'm like, well, why would you, for instance, I'd be like, hey, let's go out on a Friday night. It'd be a Friday night. I'm like, hey, let's go over to our friend's house, blah, 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 whatever. And they would be like, oh, no, I've got World of Warcraft, I've got to do this thing that lasts like 10 hours. And I'm like, what? And they'd rather do that. But I think people that are involved in those games would say, well, I am getting my social interaction because they're interacting socially with other people through, massively multiplayer online games and things like that. But I think it's a different type of interaction also. When you're talking with somebody face to face and you have that type of interaction with people, I think it's a lot different than what, the computer age has brought us with over the internet type things. There's certain things you don't pick up on. There's certain vibes, relationships, all kinds of things that just, they're not the same. It's different. It's kind of changing. And so this study specifically focused on people who were in like a social isolation. So people that were, it was just them in the room. I know a lot of people that I knew, a lot of my friends and roommates would be like, there'd be like 5 of them in a room together playing. So they would consider that social, right? Even though they'll have their headphones on and stuff. But it's really tricky. And I mean, there's a lot I could say about it from personal experience and friends, other friends. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very true. And so this Stanford psychologist has sort of a 3-pronged solution.
Yes.
He's saying parents need to be more aware of what their kids are doing.
Yes.
In some cases, there were parents who either weren't aware or were totally fine with the idea of their kids playing video games for 15 hours straight. They were saying, yeah, what's wrong with that by themselves? So parents need to be more aware of what their kids are doing.
Yes.
And then the media needs to be more realistic in its portrayals of both men and women. And then he says that sex ed in schools needs to stop ignoring emotions and romantic relationships. Right. I thought that was interesting because he's saying it's basically all about biology and contraception. That's what sex ed amounts to.
Right.
And we need to actually say, hey, there's something emotional going on here. There's a relationship, and really focus on the bigger picture of what sex is, that it's not just this biological thing where you have to make sure you don't get pregnant, but it's actually a bigger relationship, that you're giving yourself to another person emotionally, and that there's something bigger going on there.
Absolutely. We've touched on that in other topics that we've had, other stories we've discussed about how sex ed needs to change to incorporate more positive views towards things. But I think that's an interesting viewpoint on that, to incorporate relationships and things, because that is so important, and I think focusing on those new areas in sex ed could definitely help this situation out. But there's a lot of things, there's a lot of problems with this, and especially for boys, I think parents need to focus on their children and make sure they're know what they're doing, and then boys also are going to suffer negatively from this in their relationships, in their academic achievements. There's all kinds of things that they will start to fail at.
Absolutely. Coming up after the break, does the Catholic Church oppress women? We'll have a guest to weigh in.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our next story, New York Times columnist Frank Bruni drew a heated response when he said that the Catholic Church undervalues women. Quite a claim there.
Yeah.
So I've actually seen a number of different responses from women responding to his column.
Great.
And I was able to sit down earlier today with Mary Rezach, who is the co-author of one of the blogs responding to what Bruni said. So let's go ahead and take a look at what she said. Mary, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this column by Frank Bruni is entitled Catholicism Undervalues Women. As a Catholic woman, what's your response to that? Do you think that you are undervalued? Do you feel oppressed by the church?
Well, first of all, when I saw the headline and saw the article, I just kind of rolled my eyes, and it wasn't surprising to me, but it was just kind of like, oh, here we go again. Like, the world in general just doesn't understand a lot of things about Catholicism, and for some reason they have this obsession with trying to make Catholicism conform to the world. And I don't think that Bruni or a lot of people at the New York Times, for example, understand that that's not the goal of Catholicism. So that was the first thing that kind of went through my head. And then the second thing was I don't feel oppressed at all. If anything, I think my Catholic faith is something that's made me feel the most free and where I feel the most valued and where I feel like my dignity is really the most appreciated in my life. So that was kind of my reaction when I saw the piece, and I had to respond because Frank Bruni was coming at it from, he's not Catholic. I don't know if he might have some sort of a Catholic background, but he's definitely not practicing anymore, and he's a man, and so I don't think he really fully understands what it's like to be a Catholic woman. So
having a man tell you why you as a woman were oppressed didn't quite work for you.
Right, and it's just kind of insulting when anyone tells you that you're oppressed. And this is kind of what's wrong with the argument about, let's say, like missionaries and Native people. People are always like, oh, well, they just plow them over, they force them into their beliefs. It totally discounts the idea that maybe these Native people considered Catholicism and agreed with its truth and its logic. And so Bruni's kind of saying that, women are just being oppressed and we're forced into this belief and we're somehow like indoctrinated, rather than maybe we considered Catholicism in all its fullness and accepted it and chose it for our religion and for our beliefs in our life. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's look at the actual arguments. It seems like he comes down to 3 arguments that are very commonly brought up. The church doesn't allow female priesthood, the church doesn't allow birth control, the church doesn't allow abortion. Let's go through those. Why don't those things bother you? Female priesthood, that doesn't bother you?
Well, I will say when I first figured that out when I was 5 years old, it did, because my parents have never told me that there was anything I couldn't do. And so to find out that there was this thing that objectively wasn't open to me, I was kind of like, well, that's not fair. But, as I grew up and I grew to understand church teaching and it was explained to me multiple times, I have several priest friends who I kind of call like my phone a friend priests. Whenever I have questions, I ask them. And it was explained to me that, there's a couple of reasons that women can't be priests. First of all, Jesus Christ, God sent his son, Jesus Christ, as a man to earth, and that has significance. Christ instituted the church, he instituted the sacraments as a man. His 12 apostles who were at the Last Supper, who watched him institute these sacraments, were men. And so that's where the church gets its understanding that the priesthood is objectively male. It's not saying that women aren't important. Obviously, women are very important in the church. Mary gave birth to Jesus Christ. Mary Magdalene was the first one to, spread the news that the tomb was empty. And so it's saying that women's role is of no less importance. It's just different. Their role is not the priesthood. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing is that you shouldn't seek a vocation out of wanting power and authority. That's kind of the exact opposite of a Catholic understanding of the world. The priesthood vocation is ultimately a vocation of service, right? Like all of the good priests that I know, they're constantly saying mass at all times. They're giving sacraments. They're going and visiting the sick. They're doing all of these things. It's a very service-oriented vocation. And so I think a lot of the priests that I would know would kind of laugh at this idea of I went after it for the power and authority, because in reality, that's not what it is. So those are a couple of things with priesthood that I would say that's why women aren't allowed to be priests and why they can't pursue that vocation. And then with birth control and abortion, I would say that it's interesting to me that the world thinks that they kind of have a corner on the market when it comes to freedom in reproductive choice. And so the church teaches, though, that women are more free when they're working with their partner to kind of track their fertility, figure out, it's a good time for us to come together, so let's do that together, and maybe it's not a good time for us right now, and so we shouldn't. But it's more of a team effort, using natural family planning, those various, the Creighton model, different kinds of methods. And so I think that more respects women's dignity, rather than here, take this pill that's a class 1 carcinogen, and it's birth control is kind of always placed on the woman in the world, right? It's her job to take this pill, it's her job to get this injection, it's her job to get this surgery, whatever it may be. It always kind of places the huge onus on women, rather than a partners, couples working together to kind of figure this out. And then as for abortion, I mean, to me, that one's a no-brainer. Asking women to kill their own children is a violence. And even, people make the argument for rape and incest. Well, a second violence doesn't cure the first violence that was done to the woman. And so I think it's a freedom knowing that even if I became pregnant and let's say I wasn't married, the father wasn't around, that the Catholic Church, my own family, everyone who's pro-life would support me in that. And I think that's a greater freedom than the world who says, you don't want this baby, just kill it. So
Absolutely. So those are some of the things, your responses to some of the things that the church, the restrictions per se, or the things that the church says you shouldn't do. Are there any things that the church says that you can do? Are there any affirmative, positive message that the church gives you as a woman?
Sure. And when I think of affirming women, one of the first things that comes to my mind is John Paul II's letter to women. And he kind of addresses all different aspects of women's roles in the church and in the world. And he says, thank you to mothers who are raising children and building up their own little domestic churches. And thank you to women in the workforce. Like you bring just this different dynamic, maybe a more understanding, intuitive kind of perspective to the workforce. All of these different roles. I mean, women can be religious sisters. I have a cousin who's a religious sister and she works at the chancery, and so in no way do I feel shut out of the life of the church or like placed to the side or disregarded. There are so many ways that we can participate in the life of the church. So
Absolutely. One last question for you. Who are a few of your favorite women in church history and why?
It's funny, when I think of my favorite saints, when people ask me about that, I list off most of them, and most of them are women. And so I think first, obviously, Mary, the Mother of God, who I'm named after. And I used to teach summer catechesis to little kids, and I had a little talk that I gave called Mary Wasn't a Wimp. Because I think so often we think of Mary as this passive person who just God appeared to her and he like gave her Jesus in her womb, and then she just kind of went with it after that. But I don't see it that way at all. I think it wasn't her fiat, her yes to God wasn't passive. It was a very active response to God's call, God's vocation for her every day of her life. I mean, she had to choose this every day, just like we all do. So Mary, definitely. Mother Teresa, so many people know about her, and she founded her own order, and she was very stubborn and very just kind of a go-getter. And so I really look up to her. And then St. Edith Stein, she was the one who really brought us this idea of a feminine genius. And her too, I mean, she was an atheist philosopher, like top of her field, was a professor at very prestigious universities, and then she read St. Teresa of Avila's biography, another woman in the church, a doctor of the church, and I think she read the book within like a night or something, and she just decided this is truth. And so there's another example of we're not blindly choosing to be Catholic, we're accepting this as the truth in our life, and it's a beautiful thing. So those are just some of the like dozens of women that I look up to in the church. So
wonderful. Well, Mary, thanks for being here. Thank you for sharing your insight with us.
Yep, thank you.
Wow. I like that conversation you guys had. That was good. I think this is a good subject. I don't feel like we've talked about it a whole lot on this show, so I'm glad that we had the opportunity due to Frank Bruni's comments. And along those lines, I find it's always interesting how it always seems to be somebody that shouldn't be commenting on it, right? It's never a woman that's in the Catholic Church that's commenting, or that has, their comments are made public and such a spotlight like this put on it. And so I think it's refreshing to hear a conversation from two women in the Catholic Church and hear their perspective on things. So thanks for having that conversation.
It was great. Statistically, in the U.S. church, there are more women than men, and so I don't know that this argument that women are just so oppressed really holds any water. Right. Well, it's weird because it's like, well, if the church is so oppressing women so much, why are there so many women in the church, right? And so I think that comes down to, and I like that you guys talked about it, it's really important to understand what the church teaches on these subjects, because I think it comes from a big lack of understanding. It's one thing if you don't like what the church teaches, and it's another thing if you just don't know what the church teaches and are operating based on these false assumptions and false ideas about things. And that's kind of what it seemed like Frank Bruni where he was coming from. There's these old stigmas and stereotypes about things, and he's voicing his concerns. So I don't know his background, if he is a disgruntled former Catholic or what his deal is, but it sounds a lot like
disgruntled former Catholics and what they have to say about things. But I like to hear Mary's view on the positive teachings about what the church has to say about women, because there's so much beauty and there's so many things and that the church values about what women have done for us in the past and what they need to do for us continually. And so I think it's important to get the big picture, and instead of focusing on these one little things that are easily understandable once you get some explanation behind it. All right, stay tuned. We have one more story coming up after the break.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, when stylist Rachel Zoe found out that several of the staff members at her office were pregnant last year, she decided to open a nursery in the office. She calls it one of the best business decisions she's ever made.
Pretty cool. The first thing I thought when I read this story was like, how considerate of her. Like, that's like a really nice thing to do. She realized that I think there was 5 women there that are working in her office, and she's got a staff of 40 that she grew from 5 to 40, which is pretty cool in of itself. And then she wanted to keep these people around, and she herself really appreciated how much the opportunity that she had to raise her child and still have her business and everything, and balance that motherhood with her career. And so she wanted to provide that for her people, for her employees, and so she it's a big thing to do that, right? She had to buy office space, she had to staff it, she had to do lots of things in order for this nursery to become a reality. But it is a great business decision, don't you think?
It is. I think it's interesting because it's great on a human level.
Yeah.
And she's saying, hey, this is actually good for the business. This isn't just something where I throw away a bunch of money to keep my employees happy.
Right.
But actually, from a business perspective, these women are happier, they're more productive. It's actually great from that perspective as well.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really interesting when we talk about a lot of these motherhood and women working issues and sort of the intersection of that. I think that's a really interesting area in today's society.
It is.
JP2, when he was writing, he wrote a letter to women, and he had different sections in it, and he thanked mothers, and he had some really beautiful things to say. He said, thank you, women who are mothers. He said that they become God's own smile upon the newborn child. Really beautiful. He had another section that said, thank you, women who work. And he says, you make an indispensable contribution to the growth of a culture which unites reason and feeling. And he goes on to talk about the contribution that women make in the workplace. So you see this, that he's saying, yes, these two are both really good things, to be a mother and to work. But I think in a practical sense, sometimes it's hard to balance that. How do you do both?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because when you have kids, they have a lot of needs, and work is usually really demanding. So I think when we look at practical ways that we can actually integrate those two things, it's always interesting to see some of the creative options. And that was really what I thought here. And I just love this, that Rachel Zoe said, I wanted to create an environment where these new mothers wouldn't have to make a choice between career and motherhood. And she said that she really thinks of her staff as a family, which I think is so neat. And so she didn't see it as an obligation. She saw it more as an opportunity to help them grow in a human level, and then they could also produce, as employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that she saw both sides of those things, because it seems like oftentimes we hear about companies that don't really care as much as she does, especially about their employees. And they're more of a liability, or they're like, oh my gosh, they got to take all this time off for work, and from work to have their baby, and it becomes like a burden to them. But she had a really nice way of making it not some sort of burden, making it something that she could build off of. She could keep those people that have been so integral to her and her business. And I thought it was just really nice, and it made me think about my wife when she had children. And you're right, it's a tough balance, right? That work and child rearing balance. And it was tough because it's like you have to burn all your PTO time, and you have to, and then 3 or 4 months goes by, and then you're like it just goes by like that. It goes by so fast. And so it's really nice that these, I'm just envisioning, I wish they had like a video or some pictures or something, but I was just envisioning what it would be like, and I can only imagine that it must be really, really nice for those mothers to be able to just be so close. Their babies are right next door, and they can go visit them. They can go spend time with them during the workday, and it's just a nice balance that she provided for them. So I think that's really cool.
Right, yeah, and she described how one of the things that motivated her was that that's how she had been living.
Yeah.
She had been really blessed to have this ability to be a mom and try to be growing this business, which requires a lot of hours. And I kind of just loved her description of this. She said, "My days are filled with an assortment of photo shoots and school pickups, business meetings and play dates, styling sessions and grocery runs. I am launching style boxes and boxing school lunches." And so she's saying, if I can do this and I can bring my kids with me, then why not let all of my other employees do that as well?
Yeah.
And so, she's saying, there is an investment here with the physical space, the furnishings, the insurance, but the moms they're happier, they're more productive.
Right.
It really is good for everybody. And I think this is just one of those pro-life things that is really helping women to do both, to as JP2 was calling for. Pew Research Center did a study a couple of years ago, and they found that most women want to work part-time. If they could have an ideal situation and money wasn't a factor, then there's some who would want to keep working full-time, there's some who would want to be complete stay-at-home moms, but the ideal for most women is that they want to work part-time, some flexible hours, work from home, something like that. But people desire this integration.
They do, and I'm fortunate enough, my wife has been able to have that work-life balance just due to the career that she's chosen. But obviously it also helps to have great bosses and things like that. One of the things that this reminded me of, we've done stories on before, is other countries where they're trying to increase the population. They give all these benefits to their employees and things. This kind of resonated with that. And here in the U.S., it seems like there's not really much regard for mothers, and so there's not very many benefits. There's not like 8 months paid time off or anything like there is in other countries. And so this is a nice way to appreciate mothers. And I liked what Rachel also had to say. She said, "My advice to you, never apologize for being dedicated to your kids, and challenge those around you to not only acknowledge, but celebrate your ability to be a mother and an asset in the workplace." I thought that was really cool. I think that was just, she had some nice things to say in her blog. Like at the very end, she kind of wrapped everything up, and she had some very nice, strong things to say. But I really loved how, especially her as an icon in the fashion industry, she was able to support motherhood and children. It was a great pro-life view.
It's absolutely so refreshing to see that.
All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please check out our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can view more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this week. Until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.